I think sometimes when you want to learn jazz, then it's too much about learning hundreds of scales, and that's actually not really what jazz is about. There are a few scales, and especially one scale that is endlessly more important than the rest. Scales are not going to solve problems for you. If your solo doesn't sound good, then learning hypochondria and flat 6 is not really going to make you sound any better over a blues in F. And focusing on the scales takes away attention from much more important things in your playing, like melody, rhythm, and phrasing. So you're much better off focusing on the most used scale and then really learn that. And this is mainly because it's the most used scale. So you're practicing things that you need to play often. And the better you know that scale, the easier it will be to learn other scales because they're mostly just variations of this one. So of course, I'm talking about the major scale. And it's not the only scale that you need, but if you really dig into that, then you'll sound a lot better than if you try to learn 20 scales at the same time. And this is also one of the reasons why I'm not a huge fan of modes, but I'll return to that a little bit later. Let's look at what to learn and what to practice. My thoughts on what to practice are heavily influenced by how Barry Harris taught this in his masterclasses in The Hague. That was maybe one of the most important things that I learned from him. Let's just start with 2 octaves of C major. When you learn any scale, then it's useful to know what notes are in there. So C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, etc. And it is useful to know the intervals in the scale relative to the root. So root, major 2nd, major 3rd, perfect 4th, perfect 5th, major 6, major 7, octave. Basic stuff that you want to know, but that you don't want to think about unless you're figuring something out. Now, of course, just playing the scale makes for some incredibly boring melodies that everyone will get tired of very quickly. So how do you get further? When you improvise in jazz, then the melodies in your solo follow the chords of the song. And if you're playing a song in the key of C major, then a lot of those chords are actually in the C major scale. So you want to be able to find those chords. I'm going to show you how that fits on a very common jazz progression, a 2-5-1. But first, you need to be able to just find the chords. This, again, also works for other scales and is something that you want to keep in mind for working on them. A chord is a stack of thirds. So if you have the scale, then you can construct the diatonic triads by stacking 2 thirds on top of each other. Here you will get C major, D minor, E minor, F major, G major, A minor, B diminished, C major. In jazz, the basic chord type is usually a 7th chord, but all you need to get those is to add another third. To get these chords: C major 7, D minor 7, E minor 7, F major 7, G7, A minor 7, B half diminished, C major 7. Okay, so now that I'm editing, I just want to point out that I'm aware that I'm playing the 7th chord as drop 2 voicings, and that's simply just because we don't really play stacks of thirds for 7th chords very often. I think it's kind of only for the major 7 chords that you do that because they're just not very playable. So that's why I'm using to use the drop 2 voicings, which might be a little bit less clear in terms of them being stacked thirds, but they're much more playable and they're the same notes. Now you have the diatonic chords in the scale, so you can pick out a 2-5-1 since that is just the 2nd chord, D minor 7, the 5th, G7, and the 1st chord, C major 7. The 2-5-1 progression is very common in jazz and probably the most common building block in jazz songs. So it is a very useful place to demonstrate how this works and ties in with the major scale. You also want to notice that all of these chords are in the scale. So here the scale is sort of the bigger thing, containing and tying together several chords in a song. And that means that you often stay with one scale, but the important notes change with the chords. Before I get into what exercises to focus on and the Barry Harris thing, then it is useful to just look at what you actually need to do with the scale when you're soloing. As I mentioned earlier, when you improvise in jazz, then you follow the chords and you try to make melodies that make it clear what is happening in the chord progression. The easiest way to do that is to play the notes of the chord, which is simply what we call the arpeggio. If you turn the row of chords for C major into arpeggios, then you can easily play that through the scale and get some raw material for soloing. And if you take the 3 chords of the 2-5-1 and play those arpeggios together, then you have something like this. This still sounds like an exercise, because it is an exercise, but already if you start being creative with the order of the notes, you can turn this into something that sounds much more like a melody, something that has a flow moving from one chord to the next. And of course, it's not only the arpeggio notes, the scale sits under this, and you can also use those notes when you solo and take this further. You already have the exercise of playing the diatonic arpeggios in the scale, which is sort of a direct link between the chords and the scale. Another very useful option is to learn the diatonic triads, which you'll see in a bit is great material for soloing as well. And then we can get into some of the Barry Harris inspired exercises. And the notes of the 3 chords in the 2-5-1 are these. What you want to realize is that the top 3 notes of each chord is a triad, and that means that you can use F major, B diminished, and E minor as material when you create lines over a 2-5-1. That could give you this. So for soloing, it pays off to know your scale, to know the diatonic 7th chords in there, and also the diatonic triads. And it's very practical to know what notes are in the chords, because that helps you connect other arpeggios and triads to that chord and gives you more material that you can use when you solo. But these are all the basic things to give you an overview of the notes, the harmony, and how it all fits together. Another important thing to keep in mind is that you want to use this for solos, and that should be a part of coming up with what you practice. One of the things that really changed how I practiced after I had attended my first week-long Barry Harris masterclass in The Hague was a smarter, much more efficient way to practice scales. Several times in the masterclass, while Barry had taught us bebop lines and explained how they worked, he'd also taken a building block or a piece of vocabulary and turned it into a scale exercise. This direct connection between what you wanted to play in your solos and what you should practice in your scales makes scale practice much more efficient. I'll go over some of the more advanced ones as well, but the basic example that you probably heard me talk about before is playing the diatonic arpeggios as triplets with the leading note, which is sort of instant Charlie Parker. And that allows for playing lines like this. So potentially, this is of course my hot take on modes. I don't think that practicing all your different scales in all the different modes is super useful. Actually, I think there's a huge chance that that's really just a waste of time. You don't want to spend tons of time practicing all positions and diatonic arpeggios of both Dorian and Mixolydian and major and Phrygian. I think it makes much more sense to work on that when you're just playing music. And the question is actually if you want to think about them as modes or whether you're actually playing songs that are in a key and you want to just think about them as being chords that are part of a progression in that key. Because modes tends to sort of build this wall where you're sort of thinking about Dorian, the D minor 7 as one thing, and then you're using a different scale, Mixolydian on the G7, and really it's just the same scale. And that's actually also what you're hearing, so I think that's what you want to focus on for that kind of music. Now, modal music, different story, but actually there's not that much modal music that we're playing. Another great exercise that Barry used was pivot arpeggios. An arpeggio where instead of just playing the ascending arpeggio, then you play the first note, and then you move the rest of the arpeggio down an octave. You can turn that into an exercise like this. And if you take the last part of that exercise, so the C major 7 at the end, and just add a few chromatic passing notes, then it immediately becomes a great bebop phrase like this one. And this is where it starts to get really interesting, because you can really turn anything you like into a scale exercise and start to explore how it is to use the same idea or melody on other chords. As an example, you can combine the pivot arpeggio and the triplet with a leading note concept and then create a short building block like this one. As you can see, it's not a systematic way to combine the pivot arpeggio with the triplet, but it just sounds great and it will work really well in some bebop lines. But first, I'm going to take it through the C major scale. And then you can, for example, take the F major 7 version and use that on a D minor 7 chord to get something like this. Probably the best way to find more building blocks that you can turn into scale exercises and get into your playing is to learn some solos by ear so that you really start to hear the right type of melodies with the right type of phrasing. If you're getting started with jazz, then it can be incredibly difficult to find solos that are actually possible to learn by ear. So check out these 5 solos that are fairly easy to learn and also solid examples of great jazz guitar solos.